Welcome to episode 57 of the Hunt Backcountry podcast, presented to you as always by Exo Mountain Gear. You guys are in for a treat tonight. We are talking with Jason Wright, a former guest, as well as the co-host Steve Speck, of course. And Jason and Steve a couple years ago did a fantastic review of some spotting scopes. And really this review is based on an opportunity that most of us don't have. And that is, most of us aren't going to have the opportunity to sit behind thousands of dollars worth of glass and compare them side by side at the same time. Not only once, but over the period of months. So Jason and Steve spent a ton of time comparing Leica, Swarovski, Zeiss, and Vortex spotting scopes side by side in a number of conditions, both doing field tests on animals as well as doing some more scientific tests, such as looking at optics charts and things of that nature. If you were at all in the market for a spotting scope now, down the road, or just want to learn more about spotting scopes in general, this is going to be a fantastic episode to get some real-world thoughts on some of the best glass that there is. Before we dive into that, just want to give a big shout-out to Rob Pollock. He left us a review for the podcast on iTunes, which we really appreciate. Rob, we want to send you some Exo Mountain Gear swag. If you could just email us your information to podcast@exomountaingear.com. Listeners, as always, if you're enjoying the show, we would love to see your review in iTunes or wherever else you might be listening to this. It helps us tremendously. Or you can always email us with your questions, comments, or feedback to podcast@exomountaingear.com. To access the written review that Steve and Jason put together on these spotting scopes, be sure that you check out the show notes at exomountaingear.com/57. All right, let's get right into the show. Swarovski, Leica, Zeiss, Vortex go head to head in this spotting scope review with Jason Wright and Steve Speck. Jason, Steve, welcome to the show. How are you guys tonight?
Good.
I think I have
doing fantastic.
I think I have my job cut out for me to try and keep you guys on track this evening. Everybody seems a little bit chippy. But it must be the anxiety of the election because we're recording this on election night.
I can't wait for it to be over.
I don't even know if I want to.
Yeah. Let's talk about something much more helpful. Because either way, no matter how this goes tonight, I don't know how much help it's going to be. But the goal tonight's to talk about spotting scopes. That's something that get a ton of questions on, just in general in the podcast. Obviously, Steve, with what you've done with SNS Archery, being a dealer and selling a ton of spotting scopes, you get a ton of questions on it. Jason, you're the guy who's just flat out in the field a bunch using them as a mule deer hunter and a shed hunter and all the above. So, Steve and Jason, you guys sort of paired up as context for the listeners and really did an awesome side-by-side review of some amazing glass that most guys really don't have the opportunity to put their hands on, especially next to each other at the same time, and really go back and forth. And so we're going to get to that, but let's get started just with some of the basics, some of the big questions, some of the big debates that guys get into. And I guess to get into one of them right away, what are you guys' thoughts on straight versus angled when it comes to the eyepieces?
I'm pretty passionate on that one. I just cannot wrap my mind around why people are diehard straight scope guys. I started out with straight scope like a lot of people did, and after I got my first angled one, there's no going back. I can't even imagine looking through a straight scope, but there's still tons of people that love the straight. I don't understand it at all, but what are your thoughts, Steve?
Yeah, I mean, I had used straight scope in that the first scope, kind of nice scope I'd had was a Nikon ED50. It's a really small, compact scope, and you can kind of get away with it. But once you kind of step up into that, 65 millimeter, bigger 80 millimeter scopes, straight's just a pain in the butt. The angled is just a lot more versatile. whether you're glassing uphill and downhill, and just it's a lot less adjustment with the tripod and the head and everything, trying to go back and forth. Straight is nicer for kind of like target acquisition. It seems that you can. For me, it's more natural just to line it up, point right where I want to look at, and find what find that deer in the scope. Angled, there's definitely a little bit of a learning curve, but I think once you kind of learn and get used to your scope with an angled scope, it's hands down the better option.
Yeah.
And typically they're more kind of, it's going to be a little taller, but they're going to be more compact, because the scope is travel up at an angle, so that overall length is usually an inch or two shorter.
Yeah. Are there any, like, going back to those guys that you mentioned, Jason, you were kind of the diehard on the straights, are there any other, benefits that they're touting, or, reasons that you hear that guys do prefer the straight?
I think Steve nailed it there with the target acquisition. I think most of those guys haven't tried to stick with it or use the little tube on the side of the angled scope. Some scopes have them where you can get your target right in that little plastic tube and then it lines it up for you. I don't use that, but I think that's the biggest thing is like Steve said, it's a learning curve. And then I have heard people say, glassing downhill. If you're up on a peak and you're glassing downhill, a straight scope is superior. But if you're like I use the Swaro ATS, and it'll you can turn it sideways, so you're not always looking down, like cranking your neck to look straight down. You can turn the scope sideways and turn your head sideways. So to me, it's still better with the angled, but I do understand when they say looking downhill with a straight scope is easier.
Yeah, you don't have to get like
the one
top
catch. Yeah, the one catch there is that you have to have a angled scope with a rotating collar. That way you can, like Jason was saying, you can rotate the entire body, basically spins around a collar, so you can rotate that down an angle. And even then, I think it's easier to glass downhill with an angled scope because you don't have to get the tripod up so high. You can kind of just sit to the side. Definitely, like I noticed with an angle for me, it's a lot less like neck fatigue in a sense, where you're not like really straining. It's more of a natural position that you can kind of just get the scope there and usually just kind of bend your head forward a little bit in glass, where with a straight scope you're always crinking your neck trying to get in the right position.
Yeah. Cool. So, another one of the kind of big general topics before we get into specifics of models and kind of the comparison that you guys have done is obviously size. So, you mentioned, Steve, you started with like the ED50, you got something on that size. There's the 65 millimeters, the 85s, and on up from there. So certainly there's considerations of price and weight and compactness and magnification, the whole power. But really, what are some of the things that others could consider, maybe when they can get away with something a bit on the smaller, cheaper side, or when that extra size and optical quality really pays off? What are kind of the thoughts on that?
Jason, you want to tackle this one?
Sure. Yeah. Well, to me, it is all based on how you hunt, the style of hunt you prefer. Like we do mainly backpack hunts, so the lighter the better. With the exception of mule deer, the lightweight 50 millimeter scopes just don't quite offer enough for glassing for deer. So that's why most of us use 65 millimeters. But I don't think any of us would consider an 85 millimeter just because of the size and the weight of what you're going to have to lug around on your back. And the guys that I have a lot of friends that use 85 millimeters or even 95 millimeter, the Swaro, most of those guys are doing day hunts. Some of them might even be glassing from a window mount out of their truck, to where you're not lugging around this giant scope. So I think that's the main consideration, is how you're planning to use it. If you're a digiscoper and you like taking long distance pictures with your point and shoot camera or your cell phone, a lot of times the bigger the better, because the more light you can gather, the better. So the 95 or the 85 Swaro are probably going to be what you're going to want, but you can still take great pictures with the 65. Just when you get down into the 50s, the compact, lightweight scopes, you're not going to get very, very good pictures.
When have you considered the benefits of a 50? I know you've used them some even since the ED50, right, Steve? Like you tested the Vortex and things like that.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely, it's just like, to me, the perfect backcountry scope doesn't exist, because there's a big huge gap between Nikon's had this ED50, which not very many hunters know about because they don't market it towards hunters, and it's been the same scope for, I don't know, a decade. And it's a really good little scope. If you jump around, do some research on like birding forums and stuff like that, it's highly regarded for, it's like 18 or 20 ounces. I mean, super, super light. It produces a really good image. The downside is, it's, I believe, an 11 to 33, or 13 to 30 is the eyepiece. And actually, I have an ED50 still, and I have their 13 to 40 eyepiece, but from the zoom range at that 40, basically 40x going out of a 50 millimeter objective, it's like looking through a little pinhole at something. And it's, if it's got to be pretty bright conditions outside. If it gets dark at all, evenings and mornings, the image is pretty crappy as far as it's just really, really dark and hard to see. So I use those from a backpacking standpoint, and mainly for elk. It's not, you're looking at such a big animal that it's, you just want to kind of get a better look at them, and those 50 millimeter scopes are awesome. Vortex came out with theirs, 4 or 5 years ago now, maybe. And it's a really good scope. The Nikon's probably a touch better, but the Vortex one for the price and availability is a really good option. And that's, the guy who's looking to save weight, the guy who isn't necessarily really hung up on score. If you just want to get an eye on a mule deer and go, okay, he's got a good frame, I'm good enough, I'm going to go after him. Those 50s are a great option if you're backpacking. And then, like Jason hit on, you jump up to that 65. Then all of a sudden you start, usually it's the same eyepiece that companies use on their 65 and 85 and 95, whatever. It's this big jump up in price and optical quality. And it's just tough. The 65s, we're going to talk about it here in a little bit. Jason and I 2 years ago, we did a really in-depth review. We got Vortex, Swaro, Leica, and Zeiss all next to each other, and it was a better part of 2 months, I think. It was like March and April. I know we were doing some spring bear hunting and around the office, and just side by side with each scope, trying to kind of weed out which one was the best, which was really hard to do, as Jason will attest to. And then so we definitely approach everything with backpacking mentality, and weight is a big deal. That Swaro ATS seems to be a really good option for roughly 48 to 50 ounces. The 50 with the eyepiece, Jason? Right?
Yeah, I think the ATS, I want to say it was 48.
48 with
maybe,
the eyepiece.
I think it might have been 50 with the little quick plate.
Yeah, 50 with the eyepiece covers, yeah. It's just, excuse me, it's just, it comes down to weight, that if weight wasn't a factor, an 85 or 95 is going to produce an awesome image, and maybe there's some guys out there tougher than I am that are willing to pack that much weight on a backpack hunt, but they're heavy. You're looking at 60-something plus ounces, which is more than like my tent, sleeping bag, and pad combined.
Yeah, that's when you factor in what your guys' overall pack weight is, adding freaking 5 pounds to that's a huge percentage. Yeah,
absolutely. I noticed a big difference whether that scope's in the pack or not.
Yeah. So I guess we can dive into the review. As you just mentioned, kind of comparing a Leica, the Swaro, the Zeiss, and the Vortex on this review. I'd just be curious, if you guys were to do this review again today, would it kind of be that same lineup of really those options you would be considering in that 65 millimeter range? Is there any of the scopes you wouldn't consider at this point, or something that you would add into the mix now?
I think the only one to add,
there's nothing. Go ahead, Jason.
The Maven. I think Maven has some stuff that's kind of in that upper end that I think it'd probably be comparable to Vortex, but I haven't looked through them, so that's kind of speaking without knowing. But yeah. I can't think of anything else high end that's be the same for probably.
Maven, nothing's changed. Maven came out. I don't know a whole lot about them, other than I know they're a pretty new company and they sell direct. But I believe they only have like an 85 millimeter scope, so it's kind of in that upper class of bigger, heavy scopes. And then Vortex has their new version of Razer HD, which we just had one in the shop like about a month ago, and I got to look through it. And the little bit I looked through it, definitely build quality and some things are upgraded, but optically I really couldn't tell a difference. So I think it's going to be pretty much the same review that we did 2 years ago with the older Vortex Razer.
Yeah, cool. So diving into it, Jason, just to kind of set up context, as we've already mentioned, it was a very thorough review, but before we get into performance of these four next to each other, can you kind of talk, Jason, about what you were looking for in this review, how you were comparing it, what attributes were being considered, and sort of the parameters of scoring or judging these scopes compared to one another?
Yeah, see if I can remember all that. I know for like Steve and I, one of the main things was weight. That was like one of the top of the list, which it probably shouldn't be. It probably should be the actual optical performance. But we talked about edge-to-edge clarity, low light performance, contrast, sharpness, features like if it has a dual focus wheel or sunshade, or if it twist up eye cup, just little features here and there. I think that's about it as far as how we compared it. Warranty was considered, which with these high-end scopes, the warranty is it's great on all of them. You're not going to have a problem with that. So, yeah. I missed anything there, Steve, on what we reviewed it on?
Yeah, I think you pretty much covered it all. I mean, I said we did the 65 millimeters from a weight perspective. Maybe the results would be different if you jumped up to the 80, 85s. But from it, at least for us backpacking, I'm not going to pack an 85 millimeter scope unless it's, the exception to that. And I did it kind of in the summary of the review would be a once in a lifetime hunt where, or you're on a sheep hunt where you got to count age range and, there's having every advantage optically makes a lot of sense. But just for your normal hunts, backpacking in, I think 65 just makes the most sense.
Yeah. Maybe when you're older and have the horses, they can carry an 85 or carry some of the gear so you can hump an 85.
Hopefully I'm always backpacking in on foot.
All right, well, so let's go ahead and dive into it, just kind of picking some of the attributes here. A lot of these, I know that the scopes, the four that are really mentioned here, as we mentioned, super high quality, so some of that's splitting hairs, but let's go ahead and talk a bit about low light performance, if we can, and some of the things that sort of stood out when comparing these next to each other.
Well, when we first got the scopes, we figured it'd just be we're going to line them all up side by side, and we'll instantly know which one's the best. And it was really difficult. Like each time we went out, whether it was morning or evening, or if we were looking into shadows versus looking into a little bit of a sunny haze, every time we got like different. Like we're like handing the scopes back and forth, going, "Check this one out. This one's looking great right now." And it was just stunning. Yeah. Or we'd be like, the Vortex is looking just as good as the rest of them right now. And so we just we went out and we tried to get out in as many situations as we could, either spring bear hunting or looking for elk sheds or just getting out as much as we can and just putting them head to head and kind of going, all right, which one looks the best right now? Which one's the brightest in this low light situation? Or which one's the sharpest in the shadows? And just kind of ranking them on a scale of 1 to 10 until we kind of landed on which one we thought was doing the best in all these different conditions.
It was really cool because, most guys aren't going to have that opportunity to go side by side and actually get out in the field. I mean, yeah, you can go down to, a sporting goods store, Cabela's or Sportsman's Warehouse or something like that and kind of maybe inside look through one or the other, but to really take them out there in the field and get them side by side, it was pretty quickly we realized that, man, these are all really nice. It's gonna come down to really fine details, just to pick out a winner. And like Jason said, it was back and forth constantly, really between the Leica and the Swarovski as far as which one we thought was the best. And then the Vortex would just come back in there every once in a while and produce a really great image where we couldn't tell a difference between it and the others. So it was kind of it made the review really tough. And I think that's what took 2 months to do it. we thought, Jason said it was going to be like a day or two, go look through them. Oh yeah, this one's good. This one's good here. This one's good here. This one's bad. And it was far from that.
Yeah. I mean, it's been mentioned a couple times that Vortex is sort of the sleeper, and obviously it's on the lower end of the budget by a significant amount for most guys' budgets. Kind of talk about maybe, is that a good choice if guys are limited, and, obviously not everybody's ready to drop near $3,000 on a spotter.
Right. Yeah. As I said, the summary I wrote Jason kind of did the bulk of the review, and I wrote a little conclusion at the end, kind of with my thoughts that were basically aligned with Jason's, maybe a little different point of view. But I kind of came to the conclusion, if money is a factor, which it's going to be for probably 99% of the guys, and you're the guy that just gets out and hunts 4 or 5, 6 weekends a year, and trophy, whether you kill a $180 or a $193 isn't going to like ruin your day. The Vortex is a great option. It's almost a third the cost to compared to the Swaro, and just a really good scope.
Yeah, and I'd agree with that. Like when I started out, I had a Bosch & Lomb. I think it was a Bosch & Lomb Elite Discover. I can't remember the name of the scope, but it's just straight scope, and I mean it was in the $400 or $500 range, and I could still hunt the way I needed to hunt. I might not have been able to see quite as far as I wanted to, or might not have been able to pick out a little extra here and there on a deer, but in the end I could still accomplish what I wanted to accomplish. It just wasn't as nice an experience, and I definitely wasn't getting quality footage through the scope. So Vortex is a great budget option for sure.
Yeah. Do you notice a big difference, because there's considerations on, just say the Vortex versus the Swaro, and you get into the finer details of maybe contrast and optical quality, and shadows and things like that. And even as you guys have mentioned, that can vary under conditions, and the Vortex might look as good as the Swaro in certain instances. But I'm curious, in terms of the Vortex being, on the lesser end budget-wise, how do you feel about spending a lot of time behind that glass? I mean, does it really strain in your eye that much more? Is the Swaro or the Leica, optical quality making it that much easier on the eye to be behind it for an extended period of time?
For me, I always get a little bit of eye strain because I have to close one eye. So the ultimate for me would be to have like a big pair of like 15 by 56s, and I keep both eyes open. But when I'm sitting behind the scope all day, I don't care what scope it is, I'm going to get a little bit of eye fatigue just from closing one eye to make sure I can see okay. So I don't know if the bigger consideration for me on that would be the field of view of the scope. If I'm looking through a little small tunnel or like a barrel, narrow field of view versus a wide, generous field of view like the Swaro and the Leica have, that's what's going to probably strain my eye a little bit more is the narrow field of view and having to kind of, I don't know, it definitely more priority for me on the wide field of view versus the optical quality when it comes to eye fatigue.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm pretty much on the same boat. Yeah, it's they're all such. I mean, if you were looking through, I think the eye fatigue would come into play maybe if you couldn't get a good image, or you're constantly kind of going back and forth between like thinking an image is in focus and out of focus, and all these. I never really had that issue. Maybe the Vortex a touch more than the others, but like Jason said, the bigger issue is it's kind of hard to glass with both eyes open, and some guys wear like a little patch on their one eye, and I've actually tried doing that before. It really makes a nice difference. One other guy wears just a scarf and then just kind of drapes it over that one eye, so it's just kind of like this black image in front of him, and that would make a nice difference too. So, yeah.
So on that topic of focus, kind of speak to that, because as we've mentioned, some of these have a dual focus wheel, some of them have sort of a large center focus, some are more sensitive or finer in focus than the others, and some of this might sound like splitting hairs, but I think focus can actually be a big part of the experience as well. So speak to what stood out from comparing these models in terms of how the focus operated, what you preferred, and anything that might have bugged you on one of the models?
I really like the focus situation on the Vortex, having the little knob kind of right up by the eyepiece, and it had the dual speed. So if you wanted to get a nice fine adjustment, you could go out to the end of the knob. It's the finer adjustment and really dial it in. Leica also had that, and it was kind of more integrated on the side of the scope, and that worked well too. Swaro, it has a barrel focus, so it's just one big wheel in the middle of the scope, and it's really it takes a lot of movement to adjust it. So I think like you could rotate that focus around like 2.5 or 3 times from one end to the other as far as the full focus range. So it was kind of like a fine focus in itself. So if you pull the scope up on something and it happens to be blurry from riding around your pack, you really have to crank on that barrel a bunch until it gets into focus. So my favorite out of all those, I think, was honestly the Vortex. It was just easier to just get that focus dialed in, especially if you have your digiscope or camera on the eyepiece and you're trying to get that camera to just be perfectly focused. That fine focus wheel was great.
Yeah, unfortunately, the new Vortex model, they got rid of that. But yeah, that was definitely that Vortex focus was really nice. The Leica one, it just has the same concept, but I didn't find it very intuitive. I'm sure once you had the scope for a season, you would get pretty used to it, but it's kind of like a dual finger operation. You use your index finger for the coarse and your middle finger for the fine adjustment. And I don't know, Jason, if you're in the same boat, but I never just quite got used to it. And then the barrel focus of the Swaro, obviously, you just kind of grab it and twist it. The only downside I thought there was it's kind of more of a bigger movement. So when you are trying to find focus, maybe you're moving the scope a little bit too. You're always battling that. You need a really good solid tripod, so you're not getting vibrations. And so when you are moving that bigger wheel, maybe you have the tendency to move it a little bit more. But all of them in the end were just fine for achieving the goal of getting that image in focus.
Yeah. So these these 4 scopes have pretty similar but some differences among their zoom ranges. Is there anything that's kind of worth considering there? Is the Vortex is down at like a 48 max, and the Swaro can bump up to a 60 max. The others are in between at 50 and 56 with the Leica and the Zeiss respectively. Is that a consideration? Is that something that plays into how you guys are using this in the field? The difference between like something at the 50 range versus something at the 60 range. How important is that to you guys?
If I had to give up magnification on one end or the other of that range, I would probably err on giving up the upper from 50 and on. Like a lot of times when you're out in the heat of the summer scouting, when you get past 50, the mirage or the heat waves, whatever you want to call it, gets so bad that those last 10 power magnification is almost worthless sometimes, especially on a cheaper scope where the optical quality really goes down, it gets really dark and just hard to look through from like 50 and on. So if I had to pick a range, I'd almost err on the lower side, like the Vortex being 16 to 48. I'd prefer that over something that gave up that lower end and that wider field of view for scanning to get more zoom on the further end, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So the Zeiss and the Vortex on the low end are at 15, 16, and both the Swaro and the Leica jump up to 25. You do find yourself, Jason, using some of that between the 15 and the 25 range for scanning?
Yeah, for me, I like that. The wider field of view, like when it's beyond where my optics or beyond where my binos will reach. I like to just kind of get behind the scope and start scanning around with the spot and scope. And so to have that, to be able to zoom back out and get a nice wider field of view. And then when you need to, you can crank in and zoom up to like, 45, 50 if you need to. That's what I prefer. 50 and beyond is nice at times, but it's just the part that I use more rarely is the higher magnification.
Yeah. It's pretty rare that that you can have the right atmospheric conditions to utilize that 60x. at least in these smaller scopes. I think it changes a little bit on the bigger 85 and 90 millimeter objectives, but on the smaller 65s, yeah, like Jason was saying, it's once you go past 50, it goes downhill so fast that that's kind of useless. So if I really wouldn't have that be part of my decision, for general hunting purposes, is 50x is plenty.
Yeah, that's a lot of power. Let's cover the eyepiece a bit. So a couple factors there. One being, the comfort or the function of the eyepiece, is whether that's a twist cap or what have you, and then also speak to a bit about eye relief. Was there anything that kind of stood out on these for you, Jason, in that regard?
I might be a little bit different than some on this. I don't use the twist up eye cup. Maybe it's my Neanderthal brow. I just don't have a need for it. Because when I do, I end up, like, if I twist the eye cup up, I end up having to wad my eye in there closer to be able to see the full image. Because sometimes it'll narrow your field of view if you crank that up, then you have to have your eye further back. As far as eye relief, the distance your eye is from the lens, obviously the longer that is, the better. So that when you zoom up into 50, that gets shorter, or your eye relief distance gets shorter, and you'll have to wad your eye up in closer to the scope. So the twist up eye cups, borderline useless for me, but I think, Steve, you like them, right? They help you out.
No, I'm the same boat as you. I have to leave it. I just, even on my binoculars, I have them twisted all the way down all the time. For whatever reason, if I twist them out, I'm just narrowing the field of view that I get out of the image. So essentially, I'm using them like I wear glasses, and for whatever reason, that just works for me. It's funny because a lot of people just assume that twist up eye cups, you twist them all the way out, and really that's not the case. It's just that they're designed to adjust for basically the Jason's Neanderthal brow, or whether you're wearing glasses or whatever the situation is. So for me, I just like them twisted all the way down on my spy scope and binoculars.
Yeah.
Although they do come in handy for me, digiscoping my little attachment to the eyepiece. If I zoom my lens in all the way, it'll hit the glass. So I have to twist that eye cup up so that my lens on my camera doesn't zoom and hit the glass. So it is handy there. Otherwise, I think it's just a nice feature they add. I mean, if you look at some spot and scopes, I've seen twist up eye cups or not spot and scopes, rifle scopes. I've seen twist up eye cups on rifle scopes, and that's just ridiculous. Like, what's the point of that?
Yeah. Speaking of the digiscoping, Jason, are there any attributes about either of these that make it more friendly than others in terms of adaptability and things of that nature for mounting?
You mean of each one of the scopes individually?
Yeah.
No, they're pretty well all the same. As far as how for the digiscoper that I use the Tines Up. Some guys out of Utah, they're basically just an attachment that is like a bell end that it just friction mounts onto your eyepiece. They have different size rings for each different spotting scope manufacturer, so they all mount the same. The only thing that I guess is nicer about any of the scopes is having the dual focus to really adjust your focus when you're trying to zoom in on a critter.
Awesome.
So with that, the Vortex and the Leica both had that fine focus wheel that were really handy for digiscoping.
Yeah. So what other factors that we haven't covered kind of stick out from this comparison for you guys, or might help somebody who's shopping and sort of wrestling on a direction to go? Is there anything else that we haven't covered in terms of specifics that they should be considering as they're shopping?
Yeah, that was the tough. Like I said, that was the tough part of the review, is they were all so close that it's hard to somebody will call in and give like a perfect recommendation. I mean, it really comes down to price and maybe features. Vortex hands down the winner for budget-minded person. The Leica and the Swaro.
Could we maybe?
It's funny as.
Could we maybe do this then? I don't know if it would be helpful or possible, because again, there's kind of splitting hairs. But could we go kind of one by one for each of the four and talk about just kind of not in a comparison way to each other necessarily, but just kind of maybe list the pros or the cons or the strengths and the weaknesses of each one and talk about the price, just so that guys sort of have a rundown of your opinions after spending so much time with them?
Yeah, great idea.
Yeah.
Jason,
Sure.
you want to start with the Leica?
Yeah, so the Leica, hands down, it probably has the best image, clarity, contrast, edge-to-edge sharpness. It just, every time you look through it, your eye was just like, oh man, that's pretty sweet. Everything just looked good into the shadows. So that'd be the pros of it. The size, it was actually pretty compact and nice. The cons are the weight; it's pretty heavy, and the price. If you're not, if money's tight, Leica's probably not your go-to spot and scope. But optically,
what is the price there, roughly?
Steve, do you know that off the top of your head? I think it's.
real
I
close
believe
to
they're
3,
roughly
wasn't it?
3,000.
Yeah, it was real close to 3.
Right at 3. Yeah.
So
Which
definitely,
is, it's just an asinine amount of money for a spying scope, or
Yeah, it
just
was-
something to take with you hunting. I mean, it's a lot of freaking money to spend.
more than my first couple vehicles. Let's put it that way.
So for me on the Leica, same as Jason. I mean, I think we both went into the review expecting the Swarovski to kind of take the cake, and we're just continually surprised that, man, the Leica's better here, it's better here, it's better here. The hands down image went to the Leica. The one downside the Leica probably had the worst appearance of build quality. Kind of where some of the edges of the casing came together was kind of rough, which was really surprising. You think for spending that much money, you'd have this kind of pristine looking spine scope, where really like the Vortex Razer looked to be better built. I'm sure the Leica is extremely well built, like on the guts, but just the appearance of it was kind of disappointing. And then the only downside for me on the Leica was the focus. Out of all of them, it was definitely my least favorite, just because it wasn't intuitive for me. Whatever, just I think it'd take a month or so of using it to kind of get the hang of it.
Yeah. Awesome. So how about the Swaro? I think both of you guys probably take the Swaro into the field more than anything personally these days, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So yeah, just kind of give us the rundown on that, from the review, as well as from your continued use of it and why you've chosen it overall.
Yeah.
On the
And Jason, drop in just a comparison on it, because you're using the ATS, so that'd be worth talking about.
Sure. So yeah, the Swaro, like I should say that like Steve and I went back and forth on having the Swaro next to the Leica, and just they're neck and neck, honestly, as far as definition and brightness, clarity. The one thing that Leica had an edge on was just kind of the colors. Everything, the contrast in the colors was what kind of, when we say Leica had the best image, that's kind of what we're talking about. They were so close though that, I mean, on any given day, the Swaro looked better, and it just, yeah. So I just want to mention that too, because Swaro is definitely, top shelf, fantastic scope. The one we did in the review was the ATX, which is the more modular design that has an eyepiece. It's kind of split in the middle, versus the ATS, the old style, where you had this bigger body with a smaller eyepiece that attached. So what I personally use is the ATS 65 with a 25 to 50 wide angle eyepiece. And the main reason, other than I bought it before the ATX even came out, the main reason is it's the lightest 65 millimeter scope there is, or at the time it was. I think it's still right in there. So you get the same quality image and performance in the lightest possible scope you can get in a 65 millimeter. So that's kind of got derailed there, but that's what I use personally, is the ATS.
Okay. So what are the kind of the additional benefits of the ATS, or really the ATX, which was reviewed in this, and maybe some of the downsides to it and kind of that overall package?
The ATX is nice because you're mainly buying the eyepiece, or a big part of the expense is this eyepiece, which is the back half of the scope, and then you can buy different objective lenses, the 65, 85, or 95 objective to attach to it. But the one cool feature about it was they kind of took the best of the 20 to 60 eyepiece that they used to sell, or I think they still sell it. The 20 to 60 eyepiece and the 25 to 50 wide angle, they merged them into the eyepiece that's on the ATX, which is a 25 to 60 wide angle. So you kind of have the best of both of those eyepieces. Your field of view is wide. You start out at 25, but you can still zoom out to 60. So it's a good mix of those two. And the way the zoom is kind of integrated on the barrel right behind the focus wheel is pretty nice once you get used to it. You could crank in your zoom and then just move your hand forward an inch and start dialing in the focus, versus the old style ATS. Your hand would literally slide way up the scope towards your eye and zoom, and then all the way back down to the drum. It's a minor thing, but it was pretty nice once we got used to it.
Mm-hmm.
The downside is...
Yep. Sorry, go ahead.
The downside is the ATX, it was 10 ounces heavier, 10 or 12? I think it was 10.
Yeah, you jump from, I think your scope's, like I said, 48, and this one was 58.7. Looking at the review here. So yeah, it's a 10-ounce jump up, which when you're backpacking, it's a lot of weight. That's, my jet boil stove right there. Take it out of my pack, and that's the weight saving. So it's a big difference.
Yeah.
So for me on the Swaro, like I said, Jason, I mean, it was really close. That color contrast, just the image, it just always really popped. It was just like kind of high definition, and we kind of in the review here we talk about the Swaro and Leica have this almost like IMAX movie experience where they have these wide angle eyepieces, and you put your eye down to the eyepiece, and the image just kind of feels like it's wrapped around you. Where the Vortex was on the other end of it was like it looked like you were looking through like a 3-inch black tunnel, and the image was kind of at the end of that. So it kind of made you kind of have to weed past that a little bit, and that when you first put your eye up to these wide angle eyepieces, it just naturally looks really, really good. And then the Swaro being that 25 to 60, you do get that high-end magnification, which we talked about. You really can't use that often, but there are scenarios when it's nice to have, and that's kind of the best of both worlds. And then other than that, the build quality, the modular design, the focus wheel, the zoom adjustment, all of those things, in the review here, we say the Leica's the best. For the last 3 years, I've been packing this, the 25 to 60, 65 ATX for my own personal hunting, and I love the scope. It's really just an awesome scope to take with you.
Yeah.
Other than the weight, which just is frustrating to pack around. That's for sure.
All right, so let's talk about the Zeiss a bit. Just as I'm sort of thinking back through our conversation thus far, this one's just, it hasn't come up as much for good or for bad. It's just kind of floating in the middle. Right. It's really at the middle price point. It's a little over $2,000. Whereas the Leica and the Swaro up near $3,000, and the Vortex is up near $1,000. And so kind of give us the rundown. It seems like this is kind of sort of a bastard child, if you will, in the lineup.
Yeah, the oddball thing, the Zeiss was really disappointing when you kind of considered all of that. Like, it's like the ugly middle child there, where it was just, it wasn't super light, the image. We were really disappointed in. We did have the 15 to 56, which that's a huge zoom range that they packed into one eyepiece. So the benefit is that 15, like Jason was saying, you get this super wide, I believe it's like 150 something plus foot field of view, which is awesome to just kind of sit back and pick apart a big area, and then you can zoom all the way up to 56. But there's probably a reason most manufacturers don't cram that much zoom range, because I think you lose some optical quality when you're doing that. And just, all those moving parts of the glass kind of as you're zooming in and out, it's just probably harder to, get that perfected.
Yeah, and it also had like kind of a green, had a different hue to it. Like, and I think some people I read on some forums, they said they'll do that hue to kind of make it appear sharper than it is. I mean, it was a sharp scope. We did some kind of like optics chart digiscoping pictures where we'd take a picture. I can't remember if it was like 50 yards away with the digiscoper at this little optics chart, and then you can zoom in and look at the fine lines on it and see which one is the sharpest. And the Zeiss actually did really well. You can look at the pictures on that review. It was pretty sharp, but the center of the image was the sharpest. You get out towards the edges, it lost a little bit, and it just had a different hue to it, which isn't a deal breaker, but some things would appear to be more of a greenish blue.
Yeah, it's probably something you'd never notice if you didn't do them side by side, but when you're going from one eyepiece to the next, it was clearly just this greenish blue tint to it that none of the other scopes had, and it was just kind of annoying because you're like trying to glass low light conditions and certain times of the day, and you're just going back and forth, and it's just like you kind of have to readjust your eye again, getting used to it. And maybe there might be some reason, like Jason said, that it makes it appear to have better contrast or definition. I'm not sure why they do it.
And also, the other thing with that scope was the design of it. It's really bulky. The eyepiece is huge. It's kind of awkward. If I remember right, the focus wheel had like this kind of dual speed focus. Do you remember that, Steve?
Yeah, that's right. That was weird. Yeah, you could, like, if you moved it really fast, it would go into this coarse adjustment, and then as you slowed down, somehow there were some gears in there that would turn it into a fine focus, and it was just again kind of like maybe like the Leica, like it would just take some time to get used to that. It wasn't something that you just grabbed and instantly had perfected.
There's probably some Zeiss guys out there that are like, I love that scope and I love that focus, and it probably once you get used to it, it might have been great, but in the time we used it, it was okay. I mean, just wasn't my favorite.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds...
Yeah. It was definitely... Yeah.
No, I mean, I was just going to say, it sounds, we're not obviously trying to put any of these down. It's still a good scope, but, compared to what's being offered, it's kind of tough to compete. In terms of putting it up against the Swirl and the Leica.
Yeah, if you didn't have the Vortex sitting down there, that's just a touch behind in optical quality, but quite a bit cheaper. I think maybe there'd be more argument for the Zeiss, but the Zeiss just becomes kind of the middle child, where I don't know if it makes sense to buy it.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about the young gun of the children, I guess, the cheap one, but still powerful, still quality, and that's the Vortex. Mentioned quite a bit about it already, but just to kind of summarize, what are your thoughts, Jason?
I think if you're on a budget at all, you're looking for the best bang for your buck. You can't go wrong with the Vortex. It's going to do enough to get you there. You might not have the best quality photos through it. And now I'm talking about the 65, of course. There's some guys with the 85 that take great digiscoping pics and have pretty good luck with it. But overall, it's a great scope for the money. I've used it. There's some times where it's a little hazy or not quite as sharp as the Swirl might have been if I would have took my other scope. But it's a good scope for the money for sure.
Awesome. Yeah, the one bummer is they came out with a new model, and I was really excited about it, and they got rid of the focus wheel that I really like, and they made it. It's the exact same weight now as the ATX at 58 something ounces. So kind of the two features that I really liked about it, they took away. But still, when if price is a factor at all, it's just really a solid choice. We kind of did if you go to the review on our SNSR Tree blog, we kind of put a little. It's the 4 different categories that we scored it, with 5 being the total in each category. And the Vortex is we put it as a 17.25 out of 20, where the Leica was 19.75, so dang near perfect. The Swirl was 19.25, and the Zeiss was 17.5 out of 20. But so we're really talking about, the Vortex is an A, and the Leica and Swirl or A pluses. I mean, it's such a small difference. But at the end of the day, I think. Like Lenny right now has a Swirl, he has Jason's scope, an ATS, and he just wasn't happy with it in the field. And I really just think it came down to he had a few days glassing where the conditions weren't very good, because no matter how good a glass you have, if it's hazy and foggy and stuff like that, sometimes it's just not going to produce a great image. I think it's a benefit Jason and I got from spending so much time in the field with all four of these scopes is you really get a good idea of just how close these all are, and it's just coming down to picking apart the little details and features that you like or dislike.
Yeah. So we're rapidly kind of coming up on time, but something I want to address, even if it's briefly, is we're talking about this quality glass and sort of picking hairs on its performance, but really, what's underneath one of these spotters in the field is going to be critical to them performing well. And so just speak a bit about maybe tripod and head setups and what you guys have learned and experienced and prefer in that regard, because it's obviously critical to getting the most out of these spotting scopes.
I'm probably the worst guy to ask about that because I will go with the lightest weight tripod and head I can get and sacrifice stability. I have a slick 634 CF, which is a lightweight tripod, but it's a solid tripod. It's not going to be as stable as someone packing around a 7-pound Manfrotto. So can you elaborate on that, Steve? I mean, I definitely err on the light side.
Yeah, I mean, we're you got to keep in mind that we're always approaching all of our decisions from a backpacking mentality where weight is, almost always going to be your first issue. But yeah, if someone would call in and ask me about, hey, I've got $1,000 to spend on a spotting scope, like I would tell them, don't buy a $950 scope and a $50 tripod. Because you're not going to get the benefit out of that spotting scope if you're on some cheap aluminum crappy tripod that, if you have a cheap aluminum tripod and you touch the leg, you'll see a vibration just go all the way up to the scope, and your objective's just going to vibrate there for 15 seconds, and that happens basically every time you move the pan head or something like that. It's just going to vibrate, and then if wind's blowing or anything like that, it's just not going to produce a very good image. The other end of that is, we can't pack a 6, 7, 8 pound tripod with us into the backcountry, so you got to find a balance between the two. So it's definitely, there's some really good lightweight carbon fiber tripods on the market. We sell them on S&S Archery. The ones that we found are the ProMaster and some of the slick models. They're all going to be right around 2 pounds. Give or take a few ounces depending on the features and height that you want it to go to. And they're going to do a really good job, 90% of the time. If it's really windy or something like that, you can always fill a little ditty stack with rocks and hang it from the bottom of the center post to kind of offset some of the vibration. But, that's definitely something that could happen that may not happen with a really heavy tripod. And then on a head, really, I'm a huge fan of just a super smooth pan head. For some reason, ball heads and pistol grip heads exist, and it just kind of blows my mind because they're all worthless when it comes to actually panning. If you're just spotting, if you spot something with your binoculars and you're just putting a spotting scope on it to zoom in, a ball head will be okay. But most of us are using a spotting scope to glass with and actually grid and cover country, and you need that to be smooth. That the perfect example is you're zoomed into 50x on a deer and it's walking through your field of view and goes off to the side, and then you got to move the head, and it's this jerky, sticky pan head, and you got to pan it. All of a sudden your scope shoots halfway across the hillside, and you got to refine the deer. So it's really important to have just a good smooth pan head. And again, we have a few on S&S that. The Benro S2 is a good option. There's some cheaper options like a ProMaster head that's fairly inexpensive and does a good job. Not a great job, but just a good job. So, yeah, anyways, long story short, good smooth pan head is the way to go.
Awesome.
Also, when I glass, I'm almost always sitting down or kneeling, so I never have the tripod all the way extended up. It's just going to get sloppier, and your image is going to suffer. So when I say I go with a lightweight tripod, it is lightweight in actual pounds, but it's not poorly built, and I always sit down and I don't extend as few of legs as possible.
Yeah. I mean, clearly the further up there you get that thing, you're losing stability.
Yeah, that's one good tip too. Is don't use the legs of the tripod and not your center column. Sometimes I'll people like just extend the legs out a little bit and then jack the center column up, like to the very top of it. Then you're going to lose a lot of stability that way. So always use the legs first and then just do your minor adjustments with the center column.
Yeah. Well, Steve, I think your daughter's telling us that it's time to go.
She's been crying the whole time in the background. You've probably been hearing that.
That's our new addition to the podcast at this point. That's her first appearance, right?
Her first appearance, 2 weeks old. She's on the podcast.
Well, awesome. Thank you guys for your time. As always, I would just tell the listeners if you have specific questions, as it's kind of been mentioned, Steve, sells these through SNS Archery. Feel free to email him or Rob and kind of get feedback on, the pros and cons and all these models and things like that. Steve, what's the best way if somebody has optics questions at this point? Should they be just kind of emailing those to Rob directly? And if so, what's his contact information?
Yeah, Rob would be the best. Rob runs the day-to-day stuff for SNS Archery for me. So it's just rob@snsarchery.com. And then the review is just if you Google searched SNS Archery and 65 millimeter spine scope review or something like that, it'll pop right up. It's just on the blog there on the website. And like I said, it's 2 years old, but every bit's still relevant because nothing's really dramatically changed. So yeah, that'd definitely be the best way. Or you can also just call the number for SNS, and Rob will be there, and I'm always in the office next door to him. So if you got any questions that he can't help you with, definitely I'll be able to help you there.
Awesome. Well, we will get all that information posted to the show notes for this episode. As always, guys, those show notes are going to be at exomountaingear.com and then just / with the episode number. So this one's going to be 57. So if you just visit exomountaingear.com / 57, you will catch all that. So Steve, Jason, thanks again for your guys' time. Well, that is a wrap. Once again, to access the full written review, see more specs, more information, more field photos on all these spotting scopes that we discussed tonight, check out the show notes at exomountaingear.com / 57, and we will take you right to that in-depth review that Steve and Jason had put together. Until next time, guys, thank you so much for the support. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your reviews and your feedback. You can always get in contact with us at podcast@exomountaingear.com.